Assalamu alaikum, and welcome back to another episode of Justice for All Now. Today we're going to be discussing solidarity with Kashmir. Move back up, please. No, go back down, sorry. Yes, go back down. Okay, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome again to Justice for All Now. Thank you for joining us on Muslim Network TV, North America's only Muslim-focused network. Today is Kashmir Solidarity Day, also known as Yom al-Jamhur, Subhanallah, Yom Yakjehti al-Kashmir, or Kashmir Day. This is a day observed by Kashmiris on 5th of February each year in both parts of Kashmir, as well as allies in Pakistan. It is observance of support of people of conscience and their expression of solidarity with the people of the Indian side of Kashmir, Indian occupied side of Kashmir, towards their goal to get freedom from Indian occupation. This day is also observed in Kashmir to pay homage to Kashmiris who have laid down their lives in the struggle for freedom. The people of occupied Jammu and Kashmir have been struggling for their freedom and right to self-determination, a fundamental right that they have been denied for more than 70 years. 5th February is internationally marked as Kashmir Solidarity Day, a day when the supporters of Kashmir cause renew their pledge to stand with Kashmiris in their just and humanitarian cause of freedom. To discuss this, and not just this, but where do we go with this? What does solidarity mean beyond just words, beyond slogans? So our guests today are Dr. Mubeen Shah. Dr. Mubeen Shah is the world-famous Kashmiri entrepreneur who's the former president of the Chamber of Commerce and Industry in the Indian-occupied Kashmir and the ex-founder and he's the ex-founder, president of Jammu Kashmir Joint Chamber of Commerce and Industry, and he's currently living in exile in Turkey. We also have with us Dr. Ather. So Dr. Ather Zia is a political anthropologist. She's a poet. She's a short fiction writer and a columnist. She's also the associate professor at the Department of Anthropology and Gender Studies at the University of Northern Colorado. And Dr. Ather Zia has been a staunch partner with Justice for All for many years and has been the honoree for our Torch of Honor Award. We also have with us someone very dear to us, Ahmad bin Qasim, who's a writer and a young Kashmiri activist whose family is directly impacted by the Indian regime, by the incarceration of both his parents. Thank you so much for all of you for being here and being a part of this small token of solidarity that Justice for All puts together every year. We know that this is not something that can, this is a platform that we want to put together to air your voices and share news with our audience on Muslim Network TV, as well as Muslims around the world and other allies about what is happening in Kashmir, what can be done about this, and just making sure that we don't forget about our brothers and sisters in Kashmir. So thank you so much for being here. I'm going to start with Dr. Mubeen. Assalamu alaikum. Okay, I think we're having a little bit of a...
There's something wrong in there. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, Assalamu alaikum, Dr. Mubeen. So I'm going to start with you. Alhamdulillah, you have been on the ground, mashallah. your knowledge of the economic situation of Kashmir is unparalleled. And I wanted to ask you, could you share with our audience what is the economic situation of Kashmir right now? How is the regime economically exploiting Kashmiris? I think we're having a little bit of a difficult time hearing you. Okay, inshallah, I'll move on to Dr. Ather and then Dr. Mubeen whenever you get back, and inshallah, you can continue answering that question. Dr. Ather, let's talk about settler colonialism. What are the evident forms of settler colonialism that we're currently seeing in Kashmir, and what are not as the not so evident forms? If you could talk about land grabs, and we've been following you on Twitter, and you've been talking about even people who own property in Kashmir whose papers might not mean much.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Hena. I'm honored to be sharing the panel with my co-panelists, Ahmad and Dr. Mubeen, and of course, you leading the way. So, what are the evident forms of settler colonialism and what are the not so evident forms? I think everything is an evidence, whatever is happening in Kashmir right now and has happened from 1947 onwards, is an evidence of what it was going to be and how it was going to unfold. So I think there has been a debate in the past when people used to compare Kashmir with Palestine, and they would say Kashmir is not a settler colonialism issue. It's a different kind of colonialism, if at all. So I think we are in a mode right now where we really need to actively engage with the idea of settler colonialism, not just as an idea, but as it has happened on Kashmir and on Kashmiris from 1947 onwards. Even if you look at the Article 370, which was militaristically taken away by Indian government in 2019. So what exactly was happening even through Article 370 was this is a slightly different way of looking at Article 370. Kashmiris know this, but maybe not most of the international audiences have engaged with Article 370 or the special status of Kashmir in this manner, seeing this as a Trojan horse, which actually allowed India to go into Kashmir as a form of governance, as a form of truce with Kashmiris, and also start slowly and steadily eroding whatever autonomy was given to Kashmir through that very same law. So what has happened, even through the autonomy law, which was also called the special status, Article 370, the client politicians at that time in Kashmir in 1947, 48, 49, who formulated this autonomy agreement with the Indian government, it already had mechanism to go inside Kashmir to become a Trojan horse, or it was already a Trojan horse, which was taking many of the Indian laws with it, which were slowly and steadily incorporated into Kashmir's politics and into Kashmir's political system and the way that it was governed. So that article was already, the erosion started the moment it was adopted in 1949. So Kashmiris know that, because in the 1960s, why did Kashmiris have a governor and a chief minister? They started with having their own president and prime minister, just like Azad Jammu Kashmir has. But in 1960s, towards the late 60s, the nomenclature was changed. So what you see happening in Kashmir right now is an escalation of a different form that you see brazenly, and people are actually talking about it. But Kashmiris from 1947 onwards, under the Indian occupation, have actually dealt with same kind of undermining, same kind of subsuming of their autonomy, their independence. And Jawaharlal in the 1950s, Jawaharlal Nehru, who is the first Prime Minister of India, in the 1950s itself, when he's asked about the article, when he's asked about Kashmir's autonomy, he says it's just merely a process. One day it's going to go away. So it was never, and Kashmiris know this. Kashmiris have seen this. They have seen the article being abrogated slightly, not abrogated, I won't use the word, but undermined in different ways, because abrogation seems very legal, and
Mhm.
nothing that's happening in Kashmir is legal. It's all illegal, because the way the disputed territory is being governed should not be there in the first place, especially in the Indian occupied Kashmir. So going back to the evident forms and non-evident forms, I think the evident form which you see from 2019 is the complete annihilation of Article 35A, which was a guarantee of territorial sovereignty for the Kashmiris, which
Mhm.
meant that Kashmiris had right to property, they had right to franchise, and all other rights that any citizen has in their rightful country. So it
Yeah.
wasn't as if Kashmiris were holding back and they didn't want anyone to enter Kashmir. Indians have been doing business and have been leasing businesses and have been leasing lands for the longest possible time inside Kashmir. So it wasn't as if there was no business happening inside Kashmir which belonged to an Indian. It wasn't as if Kashmiris were not allowing any kind of labor, any kind of services from India. Most of it had already been taken over, and Dr. Shah can talk about it. He can talk about the power projects, and he can talk about India being the East India Company inside Kashmir from 1947 onwards. So from 2019 onwards, why we hear this more is because now it's not only the laws that are being slowly and steadily taken away, like the nomenclature of president and prime minister of Kashmir taken away and changed to governor and chief minister as if it's just another state of India,
Mhm.
or the laws that Kashmir would, decree, Kashmiris and Kashmiri legislature would decree itself. There are many topics and many concerns that were given to India
Sure.
already, and India was kind of like, legislating on that already. So it's not only those things that are happening now, but now, because Kashmiris don't have the territorial sovereignty, India has taken that away completely. So now it's open,
Yeah.
and as you see the demolitions that are happening today, India is trying to tell the world that this is for good governance. This is because people have taken or usurped the land or they have encroached. But we know that this is a classic settler colonialism example. We know what's happening with the Israeli settler colonial state in Palestine. We know how they delegitimize people from being on their own land. And then how they also mobilize public opinion against rich people. And what we see happening inside Kashmir right now, it's not rich people who have encroached. It's mostly people. They are going after definitely some people, and these people are connected to the client politicians who have carried India's water for the last 72 years. There is some sort of uh, vendetta going against those people as well to keep them in check. But at the same time, a lot of poor people, a
True.
lot of people who move from place to place, who are from different tribes inside Kashmir. They've already been. That's what was started in 2019 itself, and we
Mm.
just see an escalation of that happening now. We see poor people, marginalized people who have been given some land by the local revenue offices at some point, and were allowed these whatever kind of communities that started. We see annihilation of those happening as well. And this is not what a government does unless it wants a mass dispossession. And we see that happening in other ways as well in the economic areas. We see how.
You just mentioned economics. Let's try to get Dr. Mubeen up again so he can share with us uh, the various ways the economy is being used against its very own people.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sorry, there is some problems in my internet or something like that. But at the same time, let me tell you about this, which Ather has already spoken about, is that how do they economically control us? Is this that first of all is the control of land, and you know they have done a very systematic manner. Initially when the civilian government was there, and then chief minister is on record in the legislative assembly that 53,750 acres of land are under illegal occupation of the Indian army. Today they are saying that they are removing from people who have got even not even one canal of land. We call one canal, it is 0.20 acres, sort of. And, while as they have 53,750 acres of land illegally occupied, not the legal ones which has been given already by the government. And there have been instances where, our places like which are commercially very viable, commercially very important, and they have taken the space. They have taken those spaces in lease at a certain point of time, let us say 1950, and they in turn, when the government wanted them to shift those cantonments, they shifted and they took a different place, but even retained the old place. So this is how they have done the control of the land, and occupied our land, which is there. And and number one. Number two is that the hydroeconomics which Arthur was talking about. You see, we have this Indus Water Treaty which has been negotiated by the World Bank between India and Pakistan, wherein the rivers of Kashmir were given to Pakistan, while the rivers in the Punjab were retained by India. India was given the Bakra Nangal Dam to make, and Pakistan in turn was given the dam for financing the dam and all that. But at the same time, it is important that they what they have done is that they put hydro projects, by the government of India, and those hydro projects were open-ended. Open-ended in the sense that normally when you give a hydro project to an outside company or something like that, there is a time limit. Let us say 10, 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, 35 years is the maximum even today. When if you give a new project by the state, 35 years is the maximum you can give. But they are being given for perpetuity. And for example, they're one of their biggest corporations is the NHPC. The NHPC is a National Hydropower Corporation, and it has got about 2.5 billion it owes to the J&K state for using the water. And besides that, this company has an asset base of $97 billion with a yearly income of $710 million. And one third of its generating capacity is in Kashmir. You see, this is how they occupy our places and our assets, for example, our resources. And our water is our main resource, one of the main resources in Kashmir, particularly for hydro projects. And now, what about the economic losses which have happened to Kashmir? For example, when I was the chamber president, we calculated in 2008, 2009, we calculated that we had lost 3,000 days because of curfews and hartals and all that thing. 3,000 days. People in the West can imagine, because of COVID, when you had closure of businesses and everything, what happened to those businesses. 3,000 days means from 1990 up to date is almost 10 years we lost because of the non-settlement of Kashmir. It is not it is non-settlement of Kashmir. This is the problem, that the world does not realize that what we have suffered. And what has happened also with this is, naturally in the world, for example, after COVID, you saw the governments giving support to the industry to revive and all that. We were given but very minuscule support. Result is that our 2 generations, 3 generations of businessmen have gone into bankruptcy, and again starting it again, and then again going into bankruptcy. It is all because of non-settlement of Kashmir. And this non-settlement of Kashmir is because the basic human right of a person of right of self-determination is not given by the Indian state.
And we're also hearing a lot, there's been a massive impact on basics like the Apple economy. If you could talk a little bit about that as well.
Yes, the basic in the Apple economy, you see now presently, for example, during this period of 1990 and 2000, let us say 2008, 2009, or even 2019, there are 2 sectors which were important for our survival, because there was no tourism those days. And the only two sectors were handicrafts and horticulture economy. Now what they have done is that You see, two ways they have tried, because I was talking to some of the businessmen in Kashmir recently. They have they have done two ways which people do not know. Number one, the big corporations in India have created infrastructure in Punjab. They have imported Apple from Iran at a low duty, and resulting in that the price of the Apple in the Indian market has gone down. It is even down lesser than the production cost of our Apple. Number one, they are underselling it. The big corporations. Why they are underselling it? Because they are now creating infrastructure in Kashmir. They are creating infrastructure so that every farmer will then finally sell to them rather than sell it directly. So this is one part. Another part is that they have stopped those trucks every now and then in the transport, when they are transported, because we don't have that capacity of cold storage created in Kashmir, which will cater to the whole production of Apple. And they are stopping those trucks for one reason or the other on the highway, resulting in that these Apple, when they reach the markets like New Delhi, they're already of no use, resulting in losses. So this is another way they are going to now. Finally, what is going to happen is now the laws which they have changed. Yeah, we have to understand the laws which they have changed regarding ownership of land, you know, and they have even written that agricultural land, previously agricultural land was banned to be used for industrial purposes or anything like that. And what they will create, they will give these lands on leases to big corporations for making these apples or whatever it, and take it away from the local. It is going to happen. This is
Mm,
what how they will control the economy of Kashmir in every manner. And this
yes,
is this
everyone.
is
We're going to have to stop for a short break. We'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back. Dr. Mubeen was just talking about the economy in Kashmir and how that is being manipulated to further oppress Kashmiris by the change in laws. At this point, I'd like to bring in our guest, Ahmed, who's been monitoring the situation on the ground, has been writing about it, and also has been monitoring how religious freedom is being impacted by the laws and the impact of the occupation on religious freedom. So if we could have, welcome Ahmed.
Thank you
Assalamu
so
alaikum.
much for Alaikum Assalam, and thank you so much for having me. Um, so, when it comes to religious freedoms, now, first of all, we have to understand that at the very heart of India's occupation of Kashmir, and I would go on to say that the anti Muslim or the anti Islam hatred and animosity or Islamophobia, if you want to call it that, is constitutive of India's project of occupation in Kashmir. And it has been so since 1947. So it's not a new phenomenon. So it's not that you can trace it back only to the emergence of Narendra Modi as the ruler of India, or the emergence of the Bharatiya Janata Party as the nationalist party. And that is a mistake that we have seen political analysts make again and again, where they think that everything that is wrong in Kashmir is because the BJP has come into power. Now, if you speak to any Kashmiri and you ask them about their experience of life in Kashmir, they will tell you that they have been experiencing the condition of oppression not since 2014 or not since 2019, but the oppression goes back to the very formative years of India's rule in Kashmir. So it's been like that from day one. Having said that, now there are different ways in which we see the manifestation of this oppression when it comes to religion. Now, first is the visible aspect, the manifest aspect, and that aspect we see in the criminalization of, let's say, slaughtering a cow, or we see that in the case of the closure of mosques. We see that in the manifestation where Muslim students in different schools in Kashmir are forced to recite Hindu hymns. We see that in the manifestation of the criminalization of looking like a Muslim. So these are all manifest and visible ways in which we see the violation of religious freedoms. And this is easy to see, but there's a more sinister, or if I can say latent aspect of this religious oppression, which is that the members or the pulpits or the mosques are allowed to function. They're allowed to work. So the Indian state does not tell Muslims to stop praying. It does not close every single member, but what is said on the member is regulated, and what is said on the pulpit is controlled. So people are allowed to go to the mosques so long as once they go to the mosque and after they leave the mosque, the gathering is not going to say anything that the state does not like. So the cleric who is speaking to his people on the day of Jummah, let's say on the day of Friday, which is a day when the people come together to speak about things that matter to the community, a community whose life is marked by the condition of occupation is supposed to talk about occupation in these gatherings because that is what affects their everyday life, everyday realities. But the irony is that the Indian state will allow you to gather for Friday so long as you don't talk about the occupation on Friday. And if you talk about the occupation on Friday, then you won't be allowed to pray anymore. And these are the multifaceted forms of religious oppression that we have seen in Kashmir. And the reason why I pointed to this is because it's very easy for somebody looking at Kashmir from outside to look at Kashmiris and see them going to mosques and see them practicing their religion and say everything is right in Kashmir. But what we don't realize is that there is a regulation at a deeper level. So there is a regulation at a level where you're allowed to be a Muslim so long as the kind of Islam that you're practicing is statist. The kind of Islam that you're practicing does not mobilize you against oppression, does not mobilize you against mobilize you in the favor of speaking against oppression. Now, this is extremely important because we know right now there are multiple people in Indian prisons, Kashmiris who have been jailed, religious scholars, religious imams, and recently, last year, we saw that there was a huge drive, rather, we can say, where multiple imams and multiple religious leaders were arrested. And previously, this is not a new story, every single religious preacher and every single religious imam that speaks on questions of justice, that speaks on questions of occupation, that speaks on questions of coloniality is not allowed to speak to his people or her people. And I say her because right now we have women, Kashmiri women, who used to organize religious halaqas and work when it comes to propagating Islam among the Kashmiri Muslim women. They were put behind bars because the kind of Islam that they were preaching also taught people to resist oppression, also taught people to stand up against tyranny. So therefore, we have to take this into account. So, for example, when a Kashmiri freedom fighter is killed, martyred by the Indian state, when the freedom fighter is killed, after that, what used to happen was that the people would gather for their funeral prayers. And the funeral prayer obviously is a religious obligation for us. It's a religious practice. But let me tell you how the political and the religious are intertwined in Kashmir. Now, the moment this freedom fighter would be killed, people would gather for their funeral prayers. And because the people feel a sense of belonging not towards the Indian state, which is seen as an occupying force, but towards these people who are fighting for freedom, who are struggling for freedom, they are seen as our own. They are seen as people who embody the collective will. So when the funeral would happen, thousands of people would gather for the funeral prayers, which was seen as a religious obligation. But at the same time, this funeral prayer would become the site of resistance. This funeral prayer would become a site where people would again pledge their commitment towards freedom, would again reinforce their commitment to the cause of azadi, to the cause of liberation. So, therefore, the state stopped these funerals. Now, every single time a freedom fighter is killed, the state withholds their body. It does not return the body to the family members. It does not return the body to the people who that body belongs to, their loved ones. Because now the janaza, which was previously purely a religious practice, has a political cost for the occupation. So therefore, the relationship.
A visual
Sorry,
reminder of the occupation, right?
yeah, it's exactly, and that is the whole story in Kashmir, where you're allowed to do anything. So there's different forms of oppression. You're allowed to do anything so long as what you're doing is not threatening India's colonial project in Kashmir.
You spoke of women and their activism in Kashmir. I'd like to bring Dr. Ather over here. Dr. Ather talks a lot about colonial feminism and how that is impacting Kashmiri women and men. So, Dr. Ather, I'd really like you to highlight, especially the use of Bollywood to push out this narrative.
Thank you, Hena, for that question. First and foremost, I would like to say that when we say the gendered effects of any conflict, I feel like it's a very Eurocentric way of looking at any conflict. And I do look at gendered effects, and I do look at gendered violence and all of that. But I would like to say that Kashmir conflict affects all genders equally. Women are they are in a double bind, because being in a in a society just like any other society, which is a patriarchal society, the issues do become more problematic. But it's not as if the men are not suffering. It's not as if just give me a moment. It's not as if the men and the women are not suffering equally because of the occupation. And then they're suffering together because of the occupation. And then the communities are imploding because of the occupation. So it's not just one thing when we think about the gendered effects. And then, of course, we think about early 1990s, when the Indian occupation was really cracking down in a new form. It's not as if it hasn't been cracking down on Kashmiris from 1947 onwards, but in 1990s, after the armed struggle broke out in 1989, it did become a direct military aggression against Kashmiris. And when I say direct, it doesn't mean that military did not exist inside Kashmir and they hadn't done the structural violence that had already been prevalent. But it became more evident because now they were fighting the resistance. They were fighting the combatants face to face. So it was a different kind of fight that came to fore. And that's when early on, the Physicians for Human Rights and Asia Watch and all of that, when they looked at inside what was happening inside Kashmir, and at that time it was slightly easier for the international watchdogs to see what was happening inside, and they had allies inside at that time. So in those early days, rape was seen as a weapon of war. And when we think about rape, we do think about, and this is a trigger warning for the audience, rape is always seen as very gendered, and by that gender we mean that it's usually seen against the women. But when we look at Kashmir, 2 in every 7 Kashmiris has been tortured or has witnessed torture. Now, that torture is not just physical violence, it's also sexual violence. And you know that these most South Asian societies, even the Western societies, or European societies, very conservative and very around the conversation around rape is not open, especially with men. So when you talk to Kashmiri men who have been physically assaulted, who have been physically violated, sexually violated, they will always talk about they will always talk about sexual violence as torture. They'll never call it sexual violence because there's so much, there are many issues attached to it, especially social and religious issues. So going back to thinking about gendered violence, what I would like us to see in this moment is not a community that's kind of like segregated on the basis of gender, and women are suffering differently and men are suffering differently. First and foremost, we see them both as being imposed upon by this patriarchal military industrial occupation of India. And in that, the entire communities are imploding. And then, of course, there is the double bind of being a woman and living in a society that is what I in my work call working class patriarchy, where women have always worked side by side with men, especially from the middle class and lower middle classes. So you see the women suffering that as well, because once this violence is wreaked upon men, once the direct violence, security violence is wreaked upon men, it does affect them. Let's take a look at the cause of the enforced disappearances. The women are doubly suffering. So that happens, and that is happening inside Kashmir as well. But I do urge us to see this as, because when people think about gendered struggle of women, they think about women in this movement for APDP, and then we talk about women and how they're suffering. But the first and foremost question is the disappearance of men, that men have disappeared. And that's why these women are coming out into the streets, which they're not anymore. Since 2019, everything has been technically banned. Protests are technically banned. So I just wanted to make one regarding settler colonialism that I couldn't make earlier. When we look at Kashmir, what's happening now, it's very easy for a lot of people to and that's why I think all of us are emphasizing the fact that let's look at all of this together. It's almost like when you have a bird in the cage. If the bird looks at one bar, the one bar does not seem any bigger problem. The one bar is, a very small thing. So one bar could be the economic issue, and another bar could be the encroachment issue and the demolition issue. So, but then you have this entire set of bars, and you have these, the salakhe or the tilian of the bar. So it becomes a cage, and that's what Kashmiris are in. You have to look at all the bars to see what the cage is actually made of. Where there is economic occupation, then there is cultural occupation and cultural imperialism happening inside Kashmir. There is genocide every day. I don't think we need to go by the definition of what a genocide means and how many deaths need to occur in one time to call it a genocide. There are 100,000 people who have already been killed, combatants, non-combatants. There are disappearances, and people are being killed every day, and people are dispossessed every day. What else can a genocide be composed of? So you have to look at all these bars to see that they are really captured inside this cage of Indian occupation. So in that, I feel like all genders are suffering equally. We do have to pay attention to women's suffering, because women do suffer doubly because of the double bind. And we do, and during militarization, when there's acute militarization, and which is cracking down upon men physically, not that women are not affected, they are also physically wrecked on. So I feel like their problems do become more deepen, and they also become more invisible. But I think these are parallel struggles. While we are fighting the military Indian occupation, we also have to think about the gendered violence and violence to other genders as well, but not completely forgetting that these are communities under assault, and communities are men, women, and others.
Thank you so much for that. We're going to be taking a short break, but this is the exact reason why Justice for All is involved in, not only as a human rights organization, but as a genocide prevention and anti-genocide organization, why the Kashmir cause is something that we work on a daily basis, despite the attacks from the Indian regime on our organization, despite the all sorts of accusations that we face. The reason why we have not let go of this campaign, this project, is because this is so dire. As Dr. Ather Zia has just said, genocide, it can be a very slow burning process. You don't need to see massive hundreds and thousands of people's bodies lying on the ground for it to be a genocide. We'll be right back after these messages. Welcome back. A lot of what is happening on the ground is not being reported, not only by mainstream, commercial media in Western countries, but not even in Kashmir. Family members of victims have reached out to us at Justice for All with many of these stories. I'd like to share some of those stories with you. Last year in November, family members of a young Kashmiri female political prisoner in her 30s informed us that she has been bedridden for weeks and she cannot move without a wheelchair. Prison doctors have recommended for her to go through and undergo an urgent back surgery. Despite her critical state of health, she has not been shifted to any hospital. She's been denied the right to health care, a tactic that the Indian government has used to systematically murder ailing Kashmiri political prisoners in jail. When she was finally taken to a hospital for a brief checkup, the jail hospital staff refused to treat her, chiding her as a terrorist, and told the policewoman accompanying her to not bring these quote unquote terrorists to the hospital. Again, in December of 2022, families of two Kashmiri prisoners, a female at Tihar jail and an old political prisoner in Agra jail, informed us that they were being denied communication with their loved ones in prison, without being provided any grounds behind the denial. One of the family members of another prisoner that we are in touch with told us that their relative in Tihar jail was forced to remain standing on the monthly phone call, despite being a patient of arthritis and back ailments. Fines of over 500 rupees were imposed on any Kashmiri prisoner who sat on a chair while talking. In January 2023, a Kashmiri prisoner in Tihar jail, while most Kashmiri prisoners are where most Kashmiri prisoners are incarcerated, was diagnosed with diabetes. And I'm going into these details because these are the stories that are not being shared, right? And once they're being diagnosed with diabetes, if I could get the script back on, the Kashmiri prisoner was requested food items other than daily, just regular potatoes and breads and pulses, which would be dangerous to their health. However, the jail authorities rejected their requests and told them to eat what we offer you or don't eat. So these are similar, and another similar case occurred when a Kashmiri prisoner in the same jail complained of some pain in their hands, and medicine was given to the prisoner. And when the prisoner informed family members about this medicine, it was discovered this medicine was for epilepsy. The patient had acute lung problems, and the medicine that was given to them was specifically unfit for consumption for those who had lung problems. So the slow killing of prisoners in Indian jails is happening, and it's not being reported. And as you know, several of the stories that you all have mentioned because of the work that you do on the ground. So here I'd like to ask, and these family members at great risk to themselves are anonymously reporting this to human rights organizations, but what can be done, right? So question for Ahmed, why is this not being reported on Kashmiri media?
I think that's to any observer of how things have been in Kashmir, it's very obvious that for the state, it's interesting that I was just reading a prison memoir by one of the Kenyan writers called Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and he says that when a political prisoner is jailed by the state, he is jailed because what that isolation does to this prisoner is that it separates him from his people or her people. And those conditions of isolation make this prisoner feel that he's forgotten by his own people. After some time, he begins questioning whether his time in prison is really worth it, whether his sacrifices in prison are really worth it. Now, why aren't these stories being put out in the media is because you have journalists in prison too. And they are in prison because they reported these such incidents. So it's not just that the state is not letting journalists report things, it's also going after journalists at the same time. So we have somebody like, so in Kashmir, again, it's very interesting that the binary between a political prisoner who is usually seen as this activist or a rebel or a freedom fighter, or let's say a journalist, is not very neat. So you have Asif Sultan, for example, a journalist who has been in jail for over 4 years now. And his daughter was a few months old when he was taken to prison. Right now, she's 4 years old, and she has only seen her father in the guise of a prisoner. And she only sees him when he's brought to court hearings. And I'm sure as a 4 year old, you cannot really understand why your father is in prison. Like, it's extremely difficult. And if you speak to some of the victims of some of the family members whose loved ones have been in prison, they were told different stories. So I was told that my father was jailed for not doing his homework when I was a child. I know another Kashmiri woman whose father was not a prisoner, but he was murdered by the Indian state, and her mother used to tell her that he had gone for Hajj, and that is the story that she believed for a long time. So these stories are not being reported because the Indian state wants to invisibilize its oppression in Kashmir. It wants the journalists to act as a PR firm for it. So they are supposed to report only what the state wants them to. They are to report on the narratives of development, on the narratives of so called good governance, on the narratives of how the state is fighting against corruption, on the narratives of how the state is protecting the people from quote unquote terrorists, these terrorists who people see as the only people who belong to them. So the point here being that these facts cannot come out because these facts incriminate the regime. And it's not that the Indian state can allow, and that's what I usually hear is that when human rights organizations, they speak about how journalism or media ought to be neutral and it cannot take sides. Now, in a place like Kashmir, this is also extremely tricky because even if you're like perfectly neutral and you define everything objectively, I don't know what neutrality means to be honest, but whatever it means, if you define everything objectively, it's still going to incriminate the regime. So the only way you can survive as a journalist is by doing the journalism that is statist. And there are many ways through which the state ensures this. Either it uses, visibly visible forms of oppression like jailing journalists, intimidating them, attacking them, raiding their offices, intimidating their family members, so on and so forth. Or alternatively, it does not give advertisements to the media houses who do not toe the state's line. So it economically cripples them, renders them without any resources that are necessary for the functioning of the media house. And once you choke them economically, the media house is going to shut anyway because they don't have resources and funds to run anymore. And if they still manage to gather funds from somewhere, then they would be jailed for quote unquote terror financing. Then they would be tortured and intimidated about where they got their funds from because we are not giving you funds. So where did you get your funds from? So this is a vicious cycle of violence, and that is why in a place like Kashmir, the language, the vocabulary of legality does not work. So that is why what the state might be doing, everything might be legal but not moral, because the law is colonial, the law is Indian. Therefore, India may justify it through their own juridical framework. But the point is it moral? The point is it justifiable? It's not. But that does not mean necessarily that if, for example, a political prisoner right now in Kashmir who is jailed, his detention might be justified through Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. So UAPA, there's a clause in it that says that any individual who threatens the territorial sovereignty and integrity of the Indian nation state, and obviously for the Indian state, the occupation of Kashmir is constitutive of its integrity, is constitutive of its sovereignty. So the moment you call for freedom, the moment you call for liberation, you're a criminal if you're
Yeah.
judged by Indian law. But we don't accept that Kashmiris should be subjected to Indian law. So, just to conclude, the point is not, and I've said this over and again, the point is not that the Indian state is misusing its power in Kashmir. The point is that the Indian state should not have no power over the lives of Kashmiris. There is no just use of power possible by the hands of the Indian state in Kashmir. Its very existence in Kashmir is violent.
True. And
Just to
very,
add to, just to add to what Ahmed said, so in 2020 they did pass a media gag. So there's a law in place that Ahmed was talking about. Just to kind of like reiterate, in 2020 that was passed, which actually delineates what a fake news is, and some bureaucrat is going to decide that. So that's what they're actively using. So while censorship was always was always a reality, now it's been institutionalized. So they actually have a law in place, and again, of course, it's a law from the Indian geo body on Kashmiri bodies, and that's what they are trying to do to journalists. And we see the increasing
about
imprisonment of journalists and human rights activists uh, from 2019 onwards. But they have now fully institutionalized that censorship.
of time talking about the occupation. We've spent a lot of time talking about the various bars of the cages, as Dr. Ather had talked about. I wanted to talk about solidarity because this is Kashmir Solidarity Day, and what can we do? So, Dr. Mubeen, late January, we heard news that you're currently presiding over a newly formed Kashmir umbrella organization. So this would be covering the international Kashmiri diaspora, um, and we've seen different. So tell us more about this organization, what makes a difference, and what will keep this going, because we've seen other diaspora coalitions form, but they sort of die off after a couple of months or a certain amount of time. So what will make this different? It's a really exciting news, and I'd like to know how can organizations join, who's currently in it. So looking forward to hear more from you.
Actually, the thing is that we, about 2 months back, created a coalition, Kashmir Diaspora Coalition, wherein we from Turkey, there are, about 3 organizations in Europe, and 1 organization in America, and 1 in Canada. And we joined up, and we met in Baku, and we created this coalition because we felt that the narrative which is created in the world is it has to be created by Kashmiris themselves, number one. So this is going to be a very important part, and the basic narrative, which is very, very important for us Kashmiris, is that the right of self-determination. The messaging should be common. And I had recently gone to Pakistan, where I, met the Hurriyat, who represent us in Pakistan and as well as internationally, because the Hurriyat leadership in Kashmir is behind bars as such. So we have communicated to them also that basically that the messaging should be same. So we want everybody to come on the same platform. This is a basic start to it. And at the same time, we have thought that, you see, because whether the Pakistan state is a party to it. So it is very important for us to tell the Pakistan state what Kashmiris want. What Kashmiris want. It is very, very important for us to tell them. And and when I went there, for example, we felt that the Pakistan public and the people. I went after 43 years to Pakistan, and I felt that the passion for Kashmir is there, but not so much as it was 43 years back. So there is a situation where we have to re-strategize everything, and we are internationally placed, which we can do better, and this is what our aim is. That for example, we have to, in each area, for example, I am in Turkey, or somebody is in America, somebody is in Europe, somebody is in Britain. They have to, within their own areas, we have to basically educate the public. Because finally, end of the day, you'll understand that why we have not been successful to a large extent is also because we have gone through the governments, but it is basically the public which holds the power in these countries also particularly, who will be told that what is the actual situation in Kashmir, that we are already in genocide. Our 4.5 million people have been affected directly. 4.5 million people of the Kashmir Valley, which has a population base of only 8 million people. That means almost every alternate family is affected. This message has to go because of the number of people killed, number of people injured, number of people imprisoned, number of people disappeared. Every other family has this, one of the things, either their buildings have been destroyed by the occupation forces. So this has to be built up, and this cannot be built up by the governments only. So that is why we thought that we will certainly love to have more people with this in this more organization. There are thousands, hundreds of organizations which are not still a part of us. But once we strengthen it, and once we feel that this is the way to do, and this is how we will strengthen our first of all the narrative within the public, so that the governments of that place will get affected by it. For example, just like you see in Canada, for example, they have given now to Uyghurs a sort of a situation where they have got certain things which we were not expected 2 years back. It's basically of the people's power. So this we want that first of all that messaging should be very very clear to whoever it is, whether it is the Pakistan state, whether it is to the any other country in the world. And another thing is very important is that, for example, see, one of the most important group of countries which could help us is OIC.
Definitely.
OIC, OIC, is there, but they have not been able to implement whatever decisions they have themselves taken. For example, we could not within even OIC, but even in other countries like Britain or USA and all have a program of BDS movement. You know, because we have to understand that the Indian state has the biggest crop of corporates, and those corporates have a very, very important stake in India. And there are a lot of corporates outside India which are investing in India. And they have to be told what India does to us. How many people have been they killed? How many these things, all these things which are documented. It is not that it is not documented, it is not hearsay. It is now even for example the human rights violations which have happened, it has been documented by the UN also, the UNHRC also. But it's another thing that they have not been able to implement it. That is something different. For example, we have this in the UNHRC. They had to make a commission of inquiry. They have agreed, but they have not implemented it. Some pressure group has to be created outside Pakistan and within these countries, so that our narratives are told. We have ample people in the diaspora, Kashmiri diaspora, who can who can talk about what we are going through. We have the necessary basic people. Yeah, 5 10 years back, we didn't have a lot of Kashmiris outside in the diaspora, for example, in the media or in colleges and universities, but there are now. So we may have a critical mass which can tell a story of Kashmir which was not there 10 years back. So this is also very important, and we have to also at the same time, because we have to understand that the main component of our problem, of our main supporter is, let us say, Pakistan. We have to give we have to give an independent view to them. For example, there when I was in Pakistan, the lot of people told me that we should be talking to India. I said yes, why not talk to India, but with certain conditions, because the history is there that for all these years, after 1962, nothing has come out of it. It cannot be bilateral. It cannot be even trilateral. We have suggested that it should be four. That means we, Pakistan, India, and out of the P5, 2 or 3 countries should be present there, because then only something can happen, or else it is going to be a waste of time. And that is what we are trying, that this diaspora group will become bigger after some time, and they will put a pressure to the different countries in the world to speak about Kashmir and
Well, we're looking
get
forward
out
to
of.
We're looking forward to some great action from this diaspora coalition, and hoping to support it in whatever way we can. Before we end, I'd like to give Ahmed and especially Dr. Ather a chance to talk about solidarity. What does that mean for them beyond words? Dr. Ather, what does solidarity look like from a human rights perspective, especially from human rights organizations? What can we do better?
Well, I think one of the things that human rights organizations really need to take into cognizance that Kashmir is not a human rights issue. It's a political dispute, and the human rights abuses do not occur in a vacuum. They occur because Kashmiris are seeking a certain right to self-determination, and that's why the Indian government is cracking down on them and creating these human rights abuses. So while we see solidarity for Kashmiris in the last 30 years that has been forthcoming for human rights abuses, for issues that are arising out of these abuses that are occurring for women and for children, but they last only so much. The moment we talk about that this is a political dispute, many of them just fall off, midway. So I think that's very important for us to clarify that Kashmiris now don't really want to waste time with human rights organizations that stop at that Kashmir is a human rights violation and these violations should go away and then everything's going to be fine. No, even if India was to stop all human rights violations, even if India was to remove all the laws that are enacted on Kashmir, like the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, it still will not be solved, because these laws and these human rights violations occur because Kashmiris are asking for a certain right to self-determination. So that's something that human rights organizations need to take cognizance of. And I think what solidarity looks like for a lot of scholars, researchers, activists who are inside and outside Kashmir right now is to really tell the world that this is a genuine resistance that has been on the agenda of United Nations from 1948 onwards. It's not terrorism like India sells it to the rest of the world. And sadly, when you put Muslim and resistance together, it's easy for the world to buy it as some sort of a terrorism issue. So that's something that we are really very keen on making the international audiences, international readers and communities aware of, that this is a genuine resistance, it's not terrorism. And then also that Kashmir is not internationalized after 2019. It's already an international issue. It has been re-internationalized after 2019 because of what India has done. And I think this is the moment when Kashmiris back home have been silenced. They're not silent. They have been silenced because of these bars coming together and now fully forming a formidable occupation that looks like an occupation from inside and outside. It was called a de facto occupation early on by a lot of legal analysts, but it's a de jure occupation now. So what we really need to do, many people are thinking, okay, Kashmiris are silent. They're not silent, they're silenced. There's a lot of dissent, but this is right now the moment is what a lot of analysts also look at Kashmiris huddling together, because you have to create the new momentum, and whatever that looks like, we don't know, but we do have to recognize that they are silenced in the moment because of various forms of illegal legalities that have been put on them. But I think it's also a moment to seize the narrative, and the reason being that India is really showing its true imperial ethno-religious Hindu supremacist heart to the rest of the world. And I think it makes our job easier. So I think that's the moment that we are in. We have to seize the narrative, which we already have been laying down for the last 30 years actively and 72 years in different forms. I think this moment, we just have to tie it all together. And for lack of a better phrase, India is making it easier because now we see what we're dealing with. We see the beast of Hindu supremacy that we are dealing with, and under which it's also subsuming Kashmir, even though Kashmir is a different issue. It's not just a Muslim issue, it's a political dispute. And India is And the reason I said this is because India has its own Muslim issue and it's cracking down on its own Muslims. And many people see Kashmir under that rubric. But we emphasize that while Kashmiris might be Muslim, they're fighting the Indian constitution. They're not fighting within the Indian constitution like Indian Muslims are. So that's the moment we are in. We are in the moment of seizing the narrative. We are in the moment of solidifying solidarities that have been made in the last 30 years. And I think the world is really ready to listen to indigenous voices because that's also a decolonizing move that's happening in the West. So we are rightly placed. We just have to put everything to these dots together and just gather more solidarities.
Much love to you and for your, I mean, it's not easy. I know all of you have been on various of these shows and talking about these issues. I'm going to give the last word to Ahmed, the next generation, just pouring in his heart and into this cause. Bismillah, Ahmed.
Yeah, I think Dr. Ather, what she said, that kind of sums it up. As far as what human rights organizations could do when it comes to actionable things, I think two shifts have to take place within how they narrate and also imagine everything that's wrong in Kashmir. One is that they need to understand, as Dr. Ather pointed out, that human rights violations are symptomatic of the occupation, and therefore any attempt at helping Kashmiris without talking about occupation simply goes on to reinforce India's occupation in Kashmir. And it happens because once you ask the Indian state to give rights to Kashmiris, to give this or that right to Kashmiris, you are again reinforcing India's position of giving. Yes, you are complaining that the Indian state is not giving. Yes, you are complaining that the Indian state is taking away from Kashmiris, is dispossessing them, but you are not questioning and working towards questioning this very uh, possession of power that the Indian state has over Kashmiri lives, where it can give and it can take, it can kill and it can let live. And I think unless we bring into the fold both of these facets of power, where we question not only the Indian state's prerogative to kill Kashmiris, but also the Indian state's prerogative of letting them live, because it's this latter thing that allows them to kill Kashmiris later on. And I think the last part is that India also needs to be stopped being seen as a party to the dispute, as a legitimate stakeholder, as a legitimate speaker in the name or on the issue of Kashmir. It has to be seen as an aggressor. It has to be seen as an occupier. And it's extremely interesting given the recent Russia Ukraine war, the amount of narrative that we see in the case of Russia and its aggression in Ukraine, and it's constantly emphasized that they are aggressors there. I think in the case of Kashmir, unfortunately, that is missing. So India is not seen as this unilateral aggressor, but it's simply seen as a state that is not fulfilling its responsibilities towards Kashmiris. And the fact is that Kashmiris do not want India to be responsible towards it. They just want India to leave Kashmir. That's the only good thing India can do. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much to all of you for being here and sharing your thoughts with us. And there's so much more that we could talk about, but our time here ends. So thank you so much again to all of you. And for those of you watching, as Ahmed says, when you can see the Ukrainians as freedom fighters, protecting their land, protecting their sovereignty, this is the same lens that you need to see the Kashmiri people as. It's easy when it comes, a lot of us living here in North America have seen the solidarity that has been given to the Ukrainians, as they should be given, but we want that same sort of solidarity for the Kashmiris, inshallah, as well. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us on this episode of Justice for All Now.